please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
U.S. President Donald Trump has made his trade war with India official. Days after threatening the Narendra Modi government with retaliatory duties on exports, the United States has filed a complaint against almost all of India's export subsidy programs at the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. Now remember, this move comes hours after the Trump administration appointed Larry Kudlow, a conservative economist, as the new economic advisor. Now, why is Trump miffed? The United States trade balance with India hasn't been in positive territory for over 3 decades. From a negative $650 million in 1985, the gap has now widened to a whopping over $22,000 million last year. The U.S. Trade Representative's complaint is that India's export subsidies provide benefits to Indian exports while hurting U.S. manufacturers and workers. Now, in his complaint, Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, says, and I quote, "These schemes allow Indian exporters to sell their goods more cheaply to the detriment of American workers and manufacturers," end of quote. Among the programs opposed by the U.S. are the Merchandise Export Scheme, Special Economic Zones, Export-Oriented Unit Schemes, and Duty-Free Import for exporters. Now, what does India have to say about this complaint? Commerce Secretary Retaliatory, addressing the media earlier today, spoke with my colleague Rituparna Bhuyan, and he joins us now to take us through the highlights. Ritu, so what is the deal? Is India in a trade war with the US?
India and the US are not engaged in a trade war. That's what Commerce Secretary Rita Tiotia told me. According to WTO rules, India has 2 months, that is 60 days, to respond to United States' request on consultation on these issues. But the Commerce Secretary also made it clear that India will not back down. So what will be India's stand? Well, India needs 8 years, starting 2017, to modify its export promotion regime. That is the first demand that India will be making in the consultations. Secondly, India believes that not all export schemes are subsidies. Thirdly, India would want to know, how did US arrive at this $7 billion figure on annual export subsidy to Indian companies? But India is not too rigid in its stance. Commerce Secretary also conceded that India is willing to make changes to its export schemes. Here is Commerce Secretary Rita Tiotia in conversation with me just a short while back.
We wish to engage with each other. We certainly wish to do business with each other. So I don't see it as a trade war. Use of trade remedies, trade disputes is an ongoing sort of process. It's a part of the WTO framework. And both India and the United States use this where there is requirement. But I do not consider this a trade war by any means. And we will continue to export to the United States, and I'm sure that they will continue to export to us. We are very clear that the agreement on subsidies provides an 8-year period for phasing out of export subsidies to developing countries. India has just graduated. We presumed and we understand that we have a period of 8 years in order to phase out these subsidies. This is the position that we will share with the United States, and we hope that they would understand the need for special and differential treatment for developing countries.
We'll also, review our export policies, which after perhaps 8 years, it will be compliant to.
Certainly, we have never failed to honor our commitments to the WTO, and we will do so.
Well, that's the Commerce Secretary Rita Tiotia saying that we're not in a trade war with the US and we are willing to engage. Joining us now to discuss this further, Germany Bhagwati here with us. Also joining us today are several of our other guests. Jan Dasgupta, former ambassador to the WTO, Shailesh Kumar, Director Asia at the Eurasia Group, and Meera Shankar, former ambassador to the US. Ms. Shankar and gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the program. Mr. Dasgupta, let me start by asking you about whether this surprises you at all. I mean, look at what the US has now done and how it's moved the WTO. It's virtually questioning India's entire trade policy.
I don't think it came as a surprise to us, because since 2011, the US has been raising this issue and related issues in the Committee on Subsidies of the WTO. Now, according to the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, countries which have, based on 1990 figures, a GNP of less than $1,000 per annum can carry on giving export subsidies. Now, there is a system of calculating, and there is a system of graduating countries. Besides India, other countries have also been graduated from this list, and they are no longer eligible to offer prohibited subsidies. India, for 3 consecutive years, to my reckoning, 2013, 14, and 15, which has been notified by the WTO, I think sometime in the middle of last year, has been graduated. So we are not really entitled to provide export subsidies as provided in the WTO agreement. Now, the subsidies, various aspects of which have been called into question and by the US, and they have sought consultations. We have to see whether they really come under this category or not.
Okay. Gemini Bhagwati, you know, you heard what Mr. Dasgupta has to say, and you probably also heard what the Commerce Secretary told us in an interview a short while ago. She says, as per the agreement on subsidies that India has inked, we have 8 years to phase them out, and this goes along with the point that Mr. Dasgupta just made about India having graduated. How do you read this?
First thing I would say is that we need to take a step back. I heard the words trade war. I mean, the word war, I think, is totally misplaced. First thing is that the WTO has a dispute settlement mechanism. From what date would those 8 years be counted? And all those related issues can be discussed at the WTO. One needs to keep in mind that for some time now, the US has I think, prevented the appointment of some senior people, maybe judges, on the WTO's appropriate body. So, to the extent that the US has sought a multilateral mechanism like the WTO, it's, I think, a positive thing in a way that, you know, if the whole idea of having a WTO is if 2 countries cannot agree on some trade issue, they go to this body based in Geneva, and they sort out their differences.
So you're saying that we should see
in a manner which finally
So you're saying that we should see this. You're saying we should see this positively because the US has requested the dispute settlement consultation process with India at the WTO, as opposed to unilaterally imposing tariffs, as is the case with steel and aluminum, when which is what we've just seen the Trump administration do.
Exactly. So in this particular case, this is in a way a normal development. If you recall, in 2016, there was some dispute with regard to, I think, solar power equipment, and I think the US was objecting to what they thought was some requirement of domestic content, which was not quite consistent with the obligations that India has in terms of its membership of the WTO. And in that particular case, if my memory serves me right, because 2016 is 2 years ago, we lost that case. So that's all right. I mean, sometimes you win at the WTO, sometimes you lose. And then you adjust government policy accordingly. One needs to look at the overall relationship with US. And if
you're saying that look at the strategic relationship with the US. Yes, please go ahead, sir.
And the overall trade relationship. We, overall, our total exports to the US are about 15% of the exports to the entire world. Our imports are 6%. These are not trivial numbers. And this, I'm only referring to trade in goods. There is also a substantial, if I remember right again, I think over 55 billion of trade in services. So, in which the balance between the two sides is not as much as in trade in goods. If I remember right again, I think trade in services, we export roughly 26, they export roughly 20 billion. It's not as much different as in trade in goods, where our exports are roughly 47, and I think their exports are somewhere in the 20s, 25 or 26 billion. I'm talking about the last 12 months. not necessarily the fiscal year or the calendar year. After you told me that you want me to talk on this program, I just looked up the numbers, and that's what I remember. So I would say take it and look at the trade relationship in the overall relationship also of foreign direct investment and portfolio flows. And I'll stop there, and if you wish, I'll elaborate.
All right, I'll come back to you in a second, Professor Bhagwati, but let me go across to the former U.S. Ambassador, Meera Shankar. Ms. Shankar, would you agree there with the assessment of Professor Bhagwati that let's not get carried away, this is not a trade war? We also heard that from Rita Teotia, the Commerce Secretary, saying that, look, we wish to engage, and the fact that the U.S. has actually moved the WTO for a dispute settlement consultation is actually good news as opposed to unilateral action, as we've seen in the case with China. How concerned would you be with this?
Yes, I think the use of, multilateral institutional processes is something which is ongoing. India has taken disputes against the U.S. to the WTO. The U.S. has taken disputes against India to the WTO. We have collectively won some disputes vis-a-vis the U.S., along with countries like Brazil and so on. And the U.S. has won some cases against us. This is part of the normal process. So in that sense, certainly, it is preferable to have recourse to the multilateral processes rather than, the U.S. taking unilateral actions. As they have done on washing machines, as they have done on solar panels, as they have done on steel, as they have done on aluminium, and as they are now threatening to do with China on a whole range of goods under the U.S. intellectual property law. It's something we have to see. But, obviously, this is the first step because it's not yet sought dispute settlement. The U.S. has sought consultations with India under the WTO format.
That's right.
And we have, I think the Commerce Secretary said that India is prepared to engage on this issue with the U.S., and we don't see it as the start of a trade war. Clearly under the rules of the WTO, developing countries were allowed to use, incentives for their exports till they reach a per capita income of $1,000 at 1990, calculated on 1990 figures. And then there's a period for them to phase out the subsidies. So obviously there is, as the Commerce Secretary said, our understanding is that there is an 8-year period for developing countries to phase out subsidies, and that is the transition that we are availing of at this time. So this is something we will discuss with the U.S. And the second point, which is important, is what our ambassador to the WTO said, Mr. Das Gupta, that the question is, would all the measures which the U.S. has listed come under the WTO subsidy format, or would they be outside it? So these are technical questions, and it's good if the two sides engage with each other on this issue at the WTO. Now, economically, actually, our trade in goods and services with the U.S. was $114 billion together in 2016 and is estimated to have reached $140 billion perhaps in 2017. And India's trade surplus was about $30 billion. In services, we had a very minor surplus. The U.S. constantly has this impression that India has a huge surplus in trade and services. It's not true. Our surplus is $6 billion. So trade and services is broadly balanced, with the U.S. exporting travel, tourism, education, and so many other services to India. And so if you look at it actually from the U.S. point of view, the trade with India is just a fraction of their total trade. Compare it, their problems arise mainly, China is the
are more to do with China.
The U.S. is concerned, and it is about
absolutely. China is the elephant in the room, and they are trying to address that.
So it's a trade deficit.
No, I get that, ma'am. But I just before
$385 billion. When you compare it with 30
absolutely
billion,
no comparison.
I mean, there's no
comparison with India.
So it's not going to give the U.S. much comfort. To pressurize India.
I understand. Before I get Shailesh in on this conversation, if I may go back to you, Mr. Dasgupta, to the point that Ms. Shankar raised there. If I were to look at what the U.S. is saying, I mean, virtually every scheme has been called out. They say exports from SEZs increased 6,000% between 2000 and 2017. Exports from EOUs and Electronic Hardware Technology Park scheme increased 160% between 2000 and 2016. 8,000 products were added to the merchandise exports from India scheme. So, if we were to engage with the U.S., what kind of changes will we need to make to India's export promotion schemes, sir, in this context?
Upon graduation, the basic thing which has to be done is that subsidies which are made contingent on export performance have to be dropped. So if we have any scheme or part of a scheme which says that there is a subsidy which an exporter will get contingent upon his making and exports, that part of the scheme will have to be modified, and if I may put it plainly, it will have to be abandoned. So this is the kind of change that will have to be brought in. And of course, there is the issue of income tax benefits under the SEZ unit scheme, under the EOU scheme, under the electronics hardware park scheme, all of which have been called into question. So we will have to go into that because the US has been arguing, and the other countries have also been arguing, that a waiver of income tax dues which other exporters pays is an indirect subsidy, and it qualifies as an export subsidy. So all these legal questions will have to be gone into. Of course, there are precedences in the WTO,
which will have to be adhered with. Shailesh, let me come to you now. And, as the panel has suggested here, that let's not overstate the fact that we could be perhaps entering a situation of a trade war between India and the US, and the story between the trade imbalance between China and the US is not comparable when we talk about the US and India equation. In the context of what we've heard now from Larry Kudlow, who's just taken over as Trump's economic advisor, on the possibility of restrictions coming in on IT and telecom where China is involved, how are you reading the situation, Shailesh, and what it could mean?
Sure. So a few points. Larry Kudlow in the past has been against protectionist measures. Right after they announced the steel tariffs, he was quite against it. So fundamentally, I don't think he agrees with trade wars or a protectionist stance. I think what he may be alluding to more of is more from the national security perspective. So the U.S. Treasury has a process known as CFIUS, which is anytime a foreign entity is investing in areas that are deemed sensitive, whether it be telecom or IT, there's a review process that's undertaken to determine whether this investment should be accepted. So it's less about trade war, but more about national security. So he may be in that context, but I think it's also
but they use the national security argument. But they use the national security argument to impose the tariffs on steel and aluminum.
No, fair enough. But I think there's also worth thinking about the motives behind this. There's two ways, that, in my opinion, the Trump administration looks at trade. There's the populist part and the ideological part, and they are different. Populist is what you saw with steel, being that there is a belief in certain sections of the U.S. electorate that you need to support these industries because they're deemed sensitive to the U.S. economy. Whether that's true or not is a different point. That's populist. Then there's the ideological part, which is where I think some of these disputes are coming from with India, which is there's a belief in the Trump administration that if these other countries are offering subsidies or have import restrictions or import duties, then why does the U.S. not have the same thing? Because at the end of the day, there should be a free trade mechanism around the world. And that's where this is coming from. So I don't think it's mainly against India. From the U.S. perspective, India, I think it's been mentioned before, is not one of the top trade deficit nations. I don't even think it falls in the top 10. Most people don't look at India in that perspective. There are other countries that are higher on the list, China, of course, being one of them. So I don't think this is against India per se. There's a lot of other benefits in the relationship. This is just an ideological. But this does bring up an interesting opportunity, though, which is that one of the challenges in the U.S.-India relationship is that a lot of these issues are debated on common threads. So trade is debated and discussed on trade issues. Visa is separate. Immigration is separate.
Right.
What this presents is an opportunity to maybe cut across issues and negotiate across issues. So, for example, if India's big asks of America are visas and totalization, and the U.S. asks of India in turn are open your economy, reduce trade barriers, etc., buy more of our defense equipment, for example, then maybe you can negotiate these issues across topics. So this may be an opportunity rather than a problem.
Okay. Professor Bhagwati, let me come back to you, sir. You said that let's not overstate the trade war between India and the U.S. It isn't one. But let me ask you about what you make of the Trump administration's move now to possibly impose further restrictions and tariffs when it comes to China specifically. Are we talking about the possibility now of a global trade war?
No, those are big issues, and they are also related to perceptions on the strategic front. I think we'll need far more time than your program will allow to get into the kind of issues that you are talking about, a global trade war. I don't think it is in anybody's interest, and I think the three major blocks, if I may say, are the US, the Eurozone, and China - Japan in Asia. I'm lumping them together, although they shouldn't be. So these are the major blocks, and they've all benefited over time, over a century. China more recently, and Japan after the Second World War, with the freer trade regimes. And so while there will be this tendency for a particular administration, for instance, well, about Mr. Trump, I don't want to say anything much because, you know, the decisions and views and the people he appoints change on a daily basis. So it's very difficult to kind of think of it in a coherent manner as to how things will proceed. What I would rather say is that, you know, you are focusing on trade and the possibility of conflicts arising, not in terms of physical or that kind of conflict. You're referring to economic conflicts. But there are other ways in which countries engage with each other. They are called foreign direct investment and portfolio flows. And sometimes those flows, portfolio flows, overwhelm trade flows by many multiples.
Right.
Now, of course, they are also much more volatile, and they don't provide the kind of employment generation that trade flows do, but foreign direct investment does. And I would like to draw the attention of your viewers to the fact that on the foreign direct investment front, the U.S. is a lowly 6% of our total FDI in the last 15 years. And of course, these trade, pardon me, these tax havens like Mauritius and Singapore are at 34 and 17%. But those are some of the issues we should bring into the discussion, but that's obviously at a government-to-government level, not obviously at WTO, which is a technical body where you will also take your best, should we say, most knowledgeable officials and your lawyers too, to discuss the technicalities, as has been pointed out by some of the other panelists. But I would think that I would like to focus on India, US, rather than bring in China and the whole globe, because as I said, that will take too long. But on India, US, we need to also have a discussion on foreign direct investment, and we need to introspect. I think Ambassador Das Gupta referred to the fact that we should be now seen to have graduated. If we are graduating from one particular per capita income level to another, we need to look at our overall policies as to, are we following the policies which make it attractive for other countries to manufacture in India? And that's why I referred to FDI, because, you know, these FDI is linked to trade. if you want to be competitive globally, with less subsidies or some subsidies which are no longer legal as far as WTO is concerned, we need to be part of value chains. You know, you've heard this, I'm sure, from many of your other panelists, but just want to remind your listeners and your viewers that some of those issues become important.
You're absolutely right, Professor Bhagwati, that you know, absolutely. Absolutely. In the overall context of attracting FDI, of making India, etc., we do need to focus on other aspects of making the market much more attractive and more competitive. We are running out of time. Mr. Dasgupta, I'll give you a minute, sir, to wrap this up in terms of the next steps from here on, given the move that we've seen from the US.
There are three things which I wanted to mention. The first thing is that, of course, the consultations will take place, but under Article 4 of the Subsidies Agreement, there is a hugely compressed time frame for dispute settlement. And the panel has to submit its report in 3 months, and the appellate body in just 1 month, which can be extended to 2 months. So if it runs according to schedule, in 6 months' time, we may have the appellate body also ruling on the issue, and we may have to comply immediately, because a reasonable period of time is not given in a prohibited subsidies case, unlike in a general case. So that is the first point. The second point is, it is, as Ambassador Bhagwati also mentioned, it's a bit of a wake-up call. If we are not entitled to really have export subsidies in place, then we need to modify our schemes and become WTO compliant. But that is a big if. Only if, you know, as a result of the consultations, we are unable to persuade and we lose in the panel and we lose at the appellate body stage, that thing comes through. And the third point is, of course, it underscores the US's willingness to come back to the WTO and approach the dispute settlement body. So the US has not totally turned its face from the WTO, away from the WTO. So that is an encouraging sign.
Yes. And that is how we started this discussion, that this might not necessarily be the worst that has happened. In fact, it brings the WTO back into relevance when it concerns the US. But Jamini Bhagwati, Jayant Dasgupta, Shailesh Kumar and Meera Shankar, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV18 to explain to us the implications of the US moving dispute consultations at the WTO concerning several of India's export-related schemes. We will continue this conversation and bring you more developments, but for now, from all of us here, goodbye. Many thanks for watching.